Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Wayne Pomianski.
Hello and welcome to International Forum. My name is Wayne Pomianski and I'm delighted to be hosting today's show. Much has been going on in the Middle East, and this is the last time we had International Forum. So we've asked Yoram Ettinger, currently in Jerusalem, former Israeli Minister for Congressional Affairs at Israel's Embassy in Washington, D.C., to again join us to discuss developments in that part of the world. For those of you who may not be familiar with his background, he served as Israel's Consul General in Houston, Texas, and as Director of Israel's Government Press Office. Currently, he consults to members of Israel's cabinet and Knesset and regularly briefs U.S. legislators and their staffs on Israel's contribution to vital U.S. interests, on the root causes of international terrorism, and on other issues of bilateral concern. Highly experienced, his expertise spans U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East politics, demography and population fluxes and fallacies in the Middle East, and overseas investments in Israel's high-tech arena. So, Ambassador Ettinger, welcome back to International Forum.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you again. And again, we appreciate your joining us from Jerusalem. And I think maybe a good place to begin, of course, is in one of the subject areas that has sparked a lot of interest here in the United States, and I trust in Israel as well, and that is the topic of Israeli and Palestinian negotiators scheduled to resume long-stalled direct peace talks in Washington. I believe the initial conversations are scheduled to begin on Monday, August 12th. And this follows about 6 months of frenetic shuttle diplomacy by Secretary of State John Kerry, as well as others in the Middle East. Trying to do a little bit of background research for today's program, I saw a report in the Huffington Post quoting a U.S. State Department spokesman who indicated that Kerry had called both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also spoke directly with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And Kerry is attributed to have agreed that the talks would serve, quote, as an opportunity to develop a procedural work plan for how the parties can proceed with the negotiations in coming months. So I think who better to ask than Yoram Ettinger about what your thoughts are regarding the resumption of these talks.
Well, it seems to me that the relaunch of the talks suggests a lot about the identity of the Palestinian side to the talks, because the Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, presented a precondition. And the precondition has been releasing Palestinian terrorists who deliberately, systematically did focus on Israeli civilians. Those are terrorists which, according to Mahmoud Abbas, constitute icons of the Palestinian society. Mahmoud Abbas names community centers, streets, squares, sport tournaments after those terrorists. Now, what does it say about the values of such a partner to supposedly peace talks? This would resemble the U.S. negotiating with Iran, and Iran preconditioned such negotiation upon the release of the Muslim who committed the most recent Boston Marathon terrorism. The U.S. would never negotiate with Iran under such circumstances, and Iran would reveal itself as non-worthy for any negotiation with the U.S. And my suggestion is that the American pressure on Israel to accept that Palestinian precondition has been an act of hypocrisy because the U.S. would never contemplate releasing terrorism, let alone releasing them in order to gain acceptance of any party in the world to talk with the U.S. And certainly it tells us everything we need to know about who is Mahmoud Abbas, and negotiating real peace on one hand and demanding release of persons who committed most egregious acts of terrorism constitutes an oxymoron and not a step towards peace.
You know, you raise a very interesting point in terms of this issue of the release of prisoners. And again, sort of looking back historically, President Netanyahu in the past seems to have been, I would say, unalterably opposed to any sort of prisoner release. Yet, we're given to understand here in the U.S. that Mr. Netanyahu has supported, obviously with a lot of discretion in terms of who would be released, what their background is, whether there's maybe any indication that they have moderated their views. But how do you explain Netanyahu's apparent change in position regarding this issue of releasing some of these prisoners?
Well, people are fallible, and this has been, in my mind, a mistake on the part of the Israeli Prime Minister, who either knuckled under the American pressure or assumed that giving in on the issue of the release of terrorists would be reciprocated by a positive American policy towards Iran, a consideration which I think is absolutely out of touch with reality, because I do not think that the U.S. is so light-minded as to subordinate its policy towards Iran to the release of Palestinian terrorism. There is no linkage between the nuclear threat of Iran on one hand and the Palestinian issue on the other hand. They are absolutely exclusively disassociated from each other. They're exclusively different from each other. And I think that it was a reckless mistake. It was a mistake not only because we are going to add some 100 more terrorists to the arsenal of Palestinian terrorism, but it will constitute a tailwind to the draft of more and more Palestinian terrorism. It's going to bring out of prison individuals who are going to raise funds for Palestinian terrorism, who are going to be advisors on terrorism, and who are going to demonstrate to Palestinians that the Israeli retribution is not as steep as they thought, namely the release of Palestinian terrorism is tantamount to the erosion of Israeli posture of deterrence.
Do you feel, Yoram, that, and I would assume that some of these prisoners have been incarcerated for a long, long time, as they have aged, as they have, I don't know what's the word, maybe matured, or I guess President Netanyahu would hope that maybe they have moderated some of their extremism. And again, I'm assuming also that there would be discretion in terms of who would be released and when. If we look at, say, the history of Northern Ireland, with conflict, acts there that would certainly be characterized as terrorism. At some point, things did change. There was a breakthrough. The sides were able to ultimately compromise. Do you feel that maybe this is what the Israeli government is counting on in terms of acquiescing to what has been really a long-standing Palestinian demand as a precursor to such negotiations?
Well, unlike the conflict between Britain and Northern Ireland, the aim of the Palestinians is not limited to getting Israel out of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. As far as the Northern Irish people, their aim has never been to uproot the British people from London and from the rest of Britain. The strategic goal of the Palestinian Authority, of the PLO, of Fatah, has always been, as evidenced by the curriculum in Palestinian schools, as evidenced by the sermons every Friday in Palestinian mosques, as evidenced by Mahmoud Abbas-controlled daily media. The issue has never been the size of the Jewish state. The issue has always been the existence of the Jewish state in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in the Galilee, in the Negev, anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And therefore, there's no hope, there's no evidence for any moderation following release of prisoners. The opposite. When you succumb to pressure by a bully, the bully does not moderate his manners. The bully becomes much bullier. A recent study by the Israeli Shin Bet, the Israeli Secret Service, documents that at least 60%, 60% of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, who have been released by Israel since the conclusion of the Oslo Accord in 1993, and the number is in excess of 7,000 terrorists, but 60% have returned to active terrorism. The assumption that, we call them terrorists and they call us terrorists is very simplistic, because terrorism is not act of freedom fighting. The difference between freedom fighters on one hand and terrorists on the other hand is that freedom fighters do not focus on civilians systematically and intentionally. Freedom fighters sometimes unintentionally or very rarely do hit civilians. Terrorists, on the other hand, do focus systematically and deliberately on civilians in order to break the spirit, to demoralize the civilians, in order to cause a collapse of the confidence by the civilians in their own government, in order to bring the enemy to submission and to drag, in this case, Israel, into reckless concession. And as I said, if past cases of releasing Palestinian terrorism would have demonstrated that indeed this would advance the peace process, then I would be all for it. But when we released in 1985 some 1,100 Palestinian terrorists, they became the leaders of the 1988 wave of Palestinian terrorism. When we released then terrorists until the year 2000, they became the leaders of the next wave of Palestinian terrorism, which erupted in October 2000. Unfortunately, our current prime minister should have known better because he lost his brother over the principle of avoiding any negotiation with terrorists upon refraining from releasing terrorists. I would have expected him to stay within the realm of the legacy of his brother. Unfortunately, he has chosen to learn from history by repeating mistakes of past prime ministers rather than learning and avoiding such mistakes.
And again, your feeling is the influence of the United States in this particular case to encourage the prisoner release constitutes what you've characterized as moral hypocrisy.
Oh, absolutely, because not only was the U.S. acting against cardinal and I believe justifiable American policy, namely no release of terrorism, no succumbing to external pressure, but here you have the U.S. which refuses systematically to release Jonathan Pollard, who was no terrorist, Nobody claims that Jonathan Pollard is a terrorist, but the U.S., for its own reasons, which we in Israel are mind-boggled about, but the U.S. position has been no release of Jonathan Pollard, and it's the same USA which is leaning on Israel even brutally, trying to bring about, to snatch release of people committing egregious acts of terrorism. Not only is it moral hypocrisy, but it certainly does not advance the prospects of peace, because you cannot expect the Palestinians to be more moderate than the Americans. And therefore, we should expect now more pressure by the Palestinians for further Israeli concessions. And the more pressure exerted by the Palestinians, the more radicalized the Palestinian position, the more distant we become from the goal of achieving peace.
You publish, some very, very interesting blogs that we see here in the United States, and I was looking at the Ettinger report. I read those pretty scrupulously whenever I receive them. And last month, and I think it speaks to this issue that you've raised about pressure on the Israelis to capitulate in some of these areas. You had a very interesting article where you discussed the critical importance of Israel to resist international pressure. And in that blog, you said, quote, "Successful struggles require defiance of pressure, which has been an integral part of the Jewish people and the Jewish state from time immemorial," unquote. And we've been discussing this area, this perception that the U.S. and other Western governments are pressuring Israel regarding the resumption of talks with the Palestinians. So my question and it would be, why is defiance of pressure, which some might see as intransigence or unwillingness to compromise, why is it so strategically important to Israel?
Well, it seems to me that it's important for any individual, for any parent, for any teacher, for any boss at the workplace, and certainly in the environment of complex environment, challenging environment of international relations, and certainly in the very brutal Middle East. And certainly we Jews have learned that from way back. The story of Noah has taught us that if you want to benefit from the rainbow, you better get used to some floods on the road to achieving the benefits of a rainbow. The U.S. would not have become the pillar of humanity in modern day history if the initial pilgrims, if the founding fathers, if the U.S. all along would not have defied the jagged cutting edge of nature, the challenge posed by the Nazi regime, the challenge posed by the communist bloc or the old USSR, etc. And certainly Israel has proven itself in a very constructive defiance, and therefore we have become a major power in the area of water technology, of energy alternatives, even of space technologies, due to the fact that we are basically very low on natural resources, but very high on resilience and, again, defiance of odds. And last but not least, in the arena of international relations, if you want to benefit from the menu of international relations, you better defy challenges. If you don't defy challenges, not only want to benefit from the menu, you're going to become part of that menu.
At this point, let's set aside the issue of U.S. pressure on the Israelis. I think your point is very clear and very well articulated about the release of the prisoners. Notwithstanding that component, are you in any way optimistic about the resumption of these talks? Again, here in the United States, we're given to believe that our new Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been working extensively behind the scenes, talking to all of the influential parties about trying to bring peace to the Middle East. Do you have any optimism at all that the resumption of these talks with the Palestinians would bear fruit in the future?
No, I do not. I do not, because you cannot achieve a goal based on unrealistic assumptions. And as I mentioned before, we're talking about a conflict over the existence, not the size of the Jewish state. And every time the Jewish state concedes, retreats, appeases, it only further whets the appetite of the Palestinian side, moving towards its own goal, which is anything but coexistence with a Jewish state. I would have expected certainly my own government, but also the U.S. government to apply very fundamental values of both our societies. Because whether in the U.S. or in Israel, we would not tolerate hate education in our midst. And here we are pretending that it is possible to negotiate peace with an hate educator. It was Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, who established the system of hate education in the Palestinian Authority in 1994, and this system is maintained until this very day. How can anybody assume that the architect of hate education can conduct peace negotiation? Once again, conducting peace negotiation on the one hand and conducting hate education on the other hand constitutes an oxymoron. This is a major obstacle for peace. And I think And I think that in this case, there should have been a precondition. And the precondition should have been for Mahmoud Abbas to desist completely for a period of 2 or 5 years from hate education. And once he passes that threshold, then we can sit down and talk about peace. Until then, if we do not get involved with such a precondition to uproot hate education, not only do we deceive ourselves, but we radicalize the Palestinians, and radicalization of Palestinians simply means collusion with Palestinian terrorism. It means participation in the shedding of innocent blood.
Going back to the Huffington Post article that I was reading recently, again, statements or assertions attributed to Secretary of State Kerry based on conversations he is believed to have had both with Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Abbas. He is quoted as having said that both leaders have demonstrated a willingness to make difficult decisions that are instrumental in getting us to this point. So I'm not sure exactly what the difficult decisions would be, but I guess it implies that perhaps Abbas is maybe has expressed some willingness to move away from some of these sticking points, such as what you've described in terms of education of the youth in the Palestinian areas. Again, if that information is accurate, isn't that, to some degree a cause for some optimism that at least the conversations are starting?
Well, again, we have an easy test, and that's a test of reality. The reality is that the Palestinian Authority has not moved, has not budged a glimpse of an inch since the launching of the Oslo process back in 1993. It has been only the Israeli side which has retreated and retreated and considered mostly, not only, but mostly under American pressure. And certainly we have not seen any change, any moderation of the Palestinian hate education. And when it comes to hate education, one cannot be satisfied with 4 days of hate education rather than 5 days. There must be an end, an uprooting of hate education. There must be an end to anti-Semitic education and incitement. By the way, also anti-American hate education, anti-American incitement, pro-Bin Laden education in Palestinian schools. And when and if the Palestinians do manage to demonstrate that for a reasonable span of time, let's say 3 years, 5 years, then people like me should reassess their position. You wouldn't expect any responsible investor to invest, to co-invest with a person who has been known to be a swindler only because that swindler is promising to change his ways. An investor would never get close to a swindler, not even a reformed swindler. But even if it is possible, it would be only after that swindler would prove that indeed this person has become a decent person. Unfortunately, we have not applied that very basic common sense rule or test to the negotiation with the Palestinians, and therefore, by that alone, we are dooming them to another failure. And last and not least, the issue between Israel and the Palestinians is not land for peace. And again, we have seen that back in 1993, we performed something which Jordan did not perform when Jordan occupied Judea and Samaria between 1950 and 1967. Egypt did not perform when Egypt occupied Gaza between 1950 and 1967. In 1993, Israel gave away almost all of Gaza to the Palestinians, gave away 40% of Judea and Samaria to the Palestinians, and the Palestinian reaction since then has been much, much more intensified. Terrorism, introduction of hate education, and systematic violation of all commitments made to Israel and to the Americans. The lesson is very obvious. The lesson is that the issue is not land for peace. The issue is the nature, the character of the Palestinian side. And by the way, this also has to do with the U.S. The U.S. has been awakened in the last few days to the Al-Qaeda reality after prematurely declaring victory over Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We hear about the U.S. closing down temporarily 24 embassies all over the world due to concern about Al-Qaeda. And we should be aware that when it comes to Palestinians, there is a connection between the Palestinians and Al-Qaeda, because the mentor, the teacher of bin Laden was a Palestinian, Abdullah Azzam, from a village near Jenin in northern Samaria. The Palestinians identified themselves with bin Laden as they did with Khomeini, as they did with Saddam Hussein, as they did with the Soviet bloc, as they did with the Nazi Germany. And here we see the U.S., the number one superpower of the free world, ignoring that track record and deluding themselves that maybe such a very convincing, systematic, vicious track record will yield to a never land type of scenario. Unfortunately, this is not in the cards, and more tragically, this is not an academic exercise. Any mistake does tax us, Jews in Israel, with more and more blood as a result of Palestinian terrorism.
I wanted to ask you about this issue of the closing of the embassies and the consulates in the Mideast. Has that impacted Israel? Is the U.S. embassy in Israel open or closed or on higher alert? How has this played out in your country?
No, the American embassy in Israel is open. One does not need to be a Middle East scientist to know that while the Middle East is burning, literally burning, the Arab Street is seismic, and while we never had an Arab Spring, we experienced an internal Arab-Muslim tsunami. At this time of a great Middle Eastern fire threatening vital American interests, there's only one firefighter in the Middle East who is experienced, who is reliable, who is very effective, who is democratic and unabashedly pro-American, and that is Israel. And therefore, there is no need to close down the American embassy in Tel Aviv. It's said that at this time of spreading fire, which consumes a number of pro-American Arab leaders, the U.S. is choosing this time to clip the wings of the Israeli firefighters. So those wings are necessary today much more than they were 2 or 3 years ago, because before the eruption of the intra-Arab, intra-Muslim lava. I hope that the U.S. will come back to its senses, will stop leaning on Israel, and will get preoccupied with the real sandstorms in the Middle East, rather than be preoccupied with the Palestinian sideshow or the Palestinian tumbleweed.
I wanted to also explore with you yet another, and your postings are always fascinating, very interesting, very well researched, a lot of historical content, you know, to set a context for the positions that you take. Another of postings that I wanted to discuss, I think, was sort of headlined with what you described as elusive Middle East agreements, and your mention of a concept called taqiyya, in which you stated that Arab leaders have spoken moderately to Western media while speaking their minds to their own media. You know, in the U.S., we have this notion of, you know, speaking out of two sides of our mouths, so to speak. And, you know, Iran, of course, has elected a new president, Hassan Rouhani, here in the West, looking for anything that might yield some optimism in terms of our relationships with Iran. Rouhani has been characterized as more moderate than his predecessor, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But this concept of taqiyya certainly raises that question of, you know, what's real and what is a mirage. So maybe you could enlighten us in terms of what you mean by this concept of taqiyya, and how does it relate to the Palestinian negotiations and now this new president of Iran?
Well, the concept of taqiyya is an ancient Islamic concept which is being upheld until this very day, and it goes back to the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, which Muslims regard not just as a prophet, but in fact as a divine entity. And this concept does obligate Muslims to resort to deception in order to protect Islam, in order to protect themselves. And when they see that the odds are in favor of their enemy, Islam allows Muslims to be deceptive. In fact, go all the way even to renounce publicly Islam. And as the taqiyya principle suggests, most important is what you feel in your heart and not what you utter out of your mouth. This principle was initially produced or initiated by the Shiite Islam in face of the Sunni majority, but very quickly adopted by the Sunni Muslim majority. It has been part of intra-Muslim conflicts, intra-Arab conflicts, and much more so in conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslims. The new president of Iran, who, by the way, is a mouthpiece of the higher religious authority, Khamenei, who selected the president, who made it possible for him to run. This president was the chief negotiator on behalf of Iran with the international community with regard to the nuclear controversy. And back in 2002, the current president stated that Iran has no intention to develop nuclear, chemical, biological, or any non-conventional capabilities. Well, and the rest is history. But that was only one of the many examples of taqiyya. Taqiyya also means that you say one thing to the so-called gullible Western audience, but then you say the real thing to your own audience at home. And those who say, but that's religion, it's not politics, I would suggest to be aware that in the otherwise highly, hopelessly fragmented Arab Middle East, there's only one common denominator, and that one common denominator, coalescing factor is Islam. Nothing else binds Arabs or Muslims together but Islam. And the adherence to Islam is very vital in the daily practice of Muslim individuals, Muslim communities, Muslim regimes, Muslim nations. And it seems to me that we should be aware. We should be aware that when it comes to Islam, we're not talking about Judaism, we're not talking about Christianity. Islam, by definition, is a very, very authoritative religion. It's a coercive religion. It's a repressive religion, which does not tolerate criticism among Muslims, let alone by the so-called Christian or Jewish or Buddhist infidel. Hence, the very violent demonstration of intolerance by Muslims towards Christian or Jews who criticize the Prophet Muhammad or criticize Islam. And when it comes to democracy on one hand and Islam on the other hand, the two are diametrically opposed to each other, because for Muslim regimes, the concept of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of association, free market, free internet are tantamount to a lethal threat. And certainly coexistence with co-equal Jew or co-equal Christian negates the basic tenets of Islam. And therefore, Islam and coexistence with the so-called infidel constitutes an oxymoron. Islam and democracy also constitutes an oxymoron. And when one considers the fact that for 1400 years we haven't had intra-Muslim peace because of the nature of Islam, one can also begin and realize what is the number one most critical obstacle for of peace here in the Middle East. It is Islam, the nature of Islam, which doesn't lend itself to democracy, doesn't lend itself to peaceful coexistence, does not tolerate infidel sovereignty, infidel as they call it, Jewish Christian sovereignty in what they call the abode of Islam, the Middle East. A Jewish state in the Middle East does negate the fundamental tenets of Islam as contemporary Muslims regard it.
So I gather, Yoram, your feeling, and again, to your point about the concept of taqiyya, when it is attributed to Rouhani, the assertion that he is willing to be more transparent about Iran's nuclear plans, I assume your feeling would be, well, this is an example of the new president of Iran saying one thing to the West and probably saying something else to his constituency in Iran.
And not only that, but I think it's time for us to grow up and pay attention to the walk rather than the talk. I don't really care what the president of Iran or the spiritual leader of Iran say. I do care about what they do. And what they do is very evident. They gallop. They don't approach, but they gallop towards nuclear capability, which would devastate the supply of oil, the price of oil, and therefore the economy of the U.S. and the free world. They are going to serve as a tailwind to Islamic terrorism on the U.S.-owned mainland, supporting many sleeper cells already in existence in the U.S. They are going to further radicalize Venezuela, which is in the backyard of the U.S. they're going to accelerate nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. Turkey will not stay behind. Egypt will not stay behind, all at the expense of very vital American interests. And it's time to wake up. 60 years of economic sanctions did not produce a change in Cuba. 50 years of economic sanctions did not produce a change in North Korea. 28 years of economic sanctions have not produced change in Iran. What are we waiting for? We know what is a non-working option. A non-working option is economic sanctions. There is only one working option, and that's a limited military preemption with no boots on the ground. No boots on the ground. America has the capability because of its huge military presence in the Persian Gulf, in the Indian Ocean. Iran is no match, not conventionally and certainly not non-conventionally, to the USA. A failure by the U.S. to act would force Israel to act, and a failure, God forbid, of either one of them to act, U.S. or Israel, would present the world with a nuclear Iran, which would devastate global stability, global sanity, and any cost of military preemption to prevent a nuclear Iran would be dwarfed by the satanic cost of a nuclear Iran. And therefore, it seems to me the decision should be made, action should be undertaken, from my perspective, hopefully by Israel, because I do want Israel to boost, to upgrade its posture of deterrence in the Middle East, and acting against Iran would achieve such a critical goal for Israel.
Which we have about 10 minutes left, Yoram, and there's so many areas of the Middle East that we probably won't even have time to touch on today. But you mentioned, and I think this is a very important point, our discussion has pretty much focused on the perils of the negotiations, the buyer beware notion of, be careful in terms of what we think is happening versus appearance versus reality. You mentioned, I think your formula would entail a limited military response by the United States and presumably other Western allies. You say no boots on the ground, but what would that intervention actually consist of?
Well, a military preemption should not be limited. It should be disproportional, but with no boots on the ground. It should be. It should involve the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy. It should involve very sophisticated bombs, which would devastate the most critical sites of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The American intelligence, the Israeli intelligence know exactly the structure of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, and bombing, devastating it, does not require a single boot on the ground. No boots on the ground is required not only to avoid being dragged into a long war and to suffer unnecessary losses on the part of the U.S. or Israel, but no boots on the ground also would be a very vital message to the majority in Iran, which is tired of and disgusted with the rule of the Ayatollahs in Iran, who constitute a minority there. The message would be, we're not here to occupy Iran, we're here to do away with a regime which is unwanted by the majority of Iranians. As long as the U.S. or Israel, but mostly U.S., refrain from launching a military preemption against the Ayatollah regime, one cannot expect a regime change in Iran because the Iranian opposition did suffer a great deal in 2009 when they did rise against Ayatollahs. They expected the U.S. to stand by this uprising. The U.S. left them hanging high and dry. They're not going to try again because they learned a very, very brutal lesson. And therefore, an American action, a military preemption against the regime would also serve as a tailwind to the domestic opposition, and an American preemption is a prerequisite, a precondition for a regime change from within. And a regime change is everything which the entire world wants, which the majority in Iran wants. In 1978, the U.S. intervened in Iran on behalf of Ayatollah Khomeini against the Shah of Iran. That intervention doomed the Shah of Iran. It served as a message to the Iranian people that the U.S. Did forsake its ally, the Shah of Iran. I think it's time for the U.S. To make up for that devastating mistake of 1978, and this time intervene with no boots on the ground, but intervene on the right side rather than on the wrong side, namely on the side of the Iranian majority against the Iranian minority of the Ayatollahs.
So the notion that, and I think it's also been mentioned in our press here, that the U.S. has indicated, I guess in response to Rouhani's comments about transparency and moderation, the U.S. has said, well, you know, we're willing to engage with Iran if it turns out that the new president is willing to be more transparent about their nuclear plans. I mean, we always seem to have the option of a preemptive strike, you know, drones or bunker busting bombs, that kind of thing. Again, interpreting your feeling is that such engagement, discussions, wouldn't really lead to anything that would be beneficial for either the U.S., the West, or certainly for Israel.
Well, anybody who studies the sentiments expressed in Riyadh by the House of Saud would realize that the Saudis are panicky about Iran, and so are the Omanis and the Abu Dhabis and the Dubais and Bahrainis. All are friendly towards the U.S., and all are greatly disappointed by the U.S. because they all realize should there be a nuclear Iran, they would have to face the choice of either surrendering to Iran peacefully or violently, which would mean an end to the pro-American regimes in the Persian Gulf. And it seems to me, again, after 28 years of attempting to produce a change in Iranian policy through negotiation, through engagement, through economic sanctions, it's time to roll up the sleeves and resort to the only viable solution. Any talk on the part of the U.S. administration does embolden further the Iranians. Any new set of sanctions does provide the Iranian regime with more time, because now you have to test the new biting or effective sanctions as they are being termed. And if the U.S. is serious, then it's time to act. And acting, by the way, could be an all-out preemptive act, could be also a limited preemptive act to send a signal to the Iranians that the U.S. is serious. But engagement means, in the eyes of the Iranians and the Saudis, that the U.S. is not serious. Talking is not serious. Acting is serious.
Well, your point is is well taken. I do like to, we only have a little less than 3 minutes left in our program today. Again, we've only scratched the surface. We haven't had any time really to talk about Syria or Egypt, where Senators McCain and Senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, have been there trying to make some progress in terms of helping the Egyptians deal with the turmoil in their country, which of course is a neighbor to Israel. But I always like to end the program in the minute or so that we have left with your commentary about the Israeli economy. It seems to be doing very, very well. You mentioned recently companies such as IBM, Cisco, Lockheed Martin, EMC, prospering in Israel. I gather that the Israeli economy is doing well, notwithstanding all of these concerns that we've discussed today.
Well, the Israeli economy has its share of problems, as does any economy in the free world. However, compared with the rest of the free world, we're doing very well, which has been also a real reason for the American high-tech giants to invest in Israel, to establish research and development centers here in Israel. We derive much benefit to the economy also from our demography. In contrast with all the demographic doomsday projections, we are doing demographically, as far as number of births per Jewish woman, much better than any Arab country, let alone any Western country, which means we have 3 births per woman, trending above 3 births. Trending above 3 births compared to 2 or less births per woman in the U.S., less than 2 births per woman in Europe, means that the future of the Israeli economy looks even rosier, because we're going to produce the working hands in Israel, and those are working hands, also very qualitative hands. Israel, for instance, is today the #1 exporter of drones. We are in the forefront, along with the U.S., in the development of drone technologies, as we are with water technologies, as we are with energy alternative technologies.
Well, Yoram, let me, forgive me for interrupting. We're just about out of time. Again, very interesting conversation. I look forward to your next visit. Let me conclude by saying this has been International Forum. Our guest is former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation today, and we'll look forward to our next program.
Thank you, and I wish the fans of the Boston Celtics a better year next NBA season.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure that we could count on that happening, but the Red Sox are doing pretty well.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum Show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.